Oh, want to know the fastest way to misjudge a man? Watch what he owns and decide you've got him figured. I did that. For 11 years I did that. I looked at Rafe Colton, patched coat, boots resoled twice, a truck that started on the third prayer, and I filed him under poor and proud, the way you file a bill you can't pay. I was a fool. Not because he was rich. Because rich was the smallest, dumbest part of the truth, and it was the only part I ever came close to guessing. The thing that finally cracked him open wasn't a lawyer, wasn't a bank, it wasn't even a person. It was a horse. A big, tired, ridiculous horse named Copper, who couldn't lie the way people can, and who, on the worst night of that winter, told the whole valley a secret the man had spent half his life burying. Stay with me, because by the end of this, you're going to be angry at me for how long it took me to see it. I'm still a little angry at myself. The storm came in low and mean, the kind that doesn't announce itself so much as arrive already inside your collar. I was standing in 6 inches of cold slurry at the bottom of the wash, holding a rope I had no business holding at 63 years old, and watching Rafe Colton go down into black water after a heifer that wasn't worth his life and probably wasn't worth mine either. "Leave her, Rafe," I shouted, though the wind took most of it and handed it to nobody. "She's gone." He didn't leave her. Of course he didn't. I could have predicted that the way you predict sunrise, not because it's kind but because it's fixed, a law of the world. Rafe Colton did not leave things in the water. The heifer had gotten pinned against the culvert by the current, her eyes wide and white and rolling, and Rafe waded in up to his chest with a rope looped over one shoulder, and the flood shoved him sideways like it had a grudge. I saw his hat go. Just gone, downstream, a dark shape swallowed by darker water. He didn't reach for it. A man reaches for his hat on instinct. Rafe let it go because both hands were busy saving something that wasn't his. That was the first thing I ever noticed about him that should have told me. His hands were always busy saving something that wasn't his. I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me back up, the way I do in the logbook I keep, a habit my late wife called your paper conscience, because I'd write down the things I was too much of a coward to say out loud. I've got 11 years of Rafe Colton in those pages, and I read them different now. He came into the Sweetwater Valley in the fall of the year my knees gave out. Drove up in that same coughing truck, pulling a stock trailer with one horse in it, and asked around about work. Nobody had cash to hire, but old Delphine Hayes had 40 acres going to ruin and a barn with a hole in the roof, and she let him stay in exchange for fixing the fences. He fixed a lot more than the fences. By spring her cattle were fat and her roof was tight, and she was calling him that Colton boy with something in her voice that sounded like it wanted to be pride, but was scared to commit. I met him at the feed store. He was counting out dollar bills, actual paper, folded soft as cloth from being handled to pay for a bag of oats, and he came up short by $1.10. The kid behind the counter, Marcus, got that pinched look kids get when they've been told not to extend credit, and Rafe just nodded easy and said he'd take the smaller bag. I paid the $1.10. Wasn't charity. I was buying a look at the man. He turned to me with a face that was younger than his hands and older than his eyes and said, "I'll pay you back Thursday." He paid me back Thursday. With interest he insisted on a quarter because he said a debt that doesn't cost you anything isn't a debt. It's a favor pretending. I told him that was a strange way to think about $1. He said his daddy taught him money and left it there, and something crossed his face when he said daddy, a shadow with weather in it, and I was too polite or too dumb to follow it. Money, I wrote that down that night in the logbook with a little question mark, because who talks like that about $1.10? His daddy taught him money. At the time I thought it was the pride of a poor man, a man who's never had it learns to worship the little he handles. I had it exactly backward. It's the men who have watched money ruin everything they loved who talk about it like a loaded gun. Copper, let me tell you about the horse before I tell you about the man, because in the end the horse is how you understand him. He was a bay gelding, big through the chest, 16 too easy, with a copper sheen to his coat in summer that went dull and shaggy come winter. Old when Rafe brought him, I'd have guessed 18, 20. A working man's horse, I figured. The kind you find cheap because his best years are spent. Except Copper moved wrong for a cheap horse. I couldn't have said it in words back then, but I felt it, the way you feel a false note in a song you don't know. He carried himself like something that had been made, not just raised. When Rafe worked him, the horse turned on a thought, stopped square, backed straight as a chalk line. He had manners bred into the marrow. And Rafe was gentle with him past all reason. Not soft. Rafe was never soft but careful, the way you're careful with the last photograph of someone. I saw him once early on, when he didn't know I was watching. He'd finished mending a stretch of Delphine's fence and he went to Copper and put his forehead flat against the horse's neck and just stood there. A long time. The horse stood too, one hind foot cocked, patient. And Rafe's shoulders were shaking just a little, and I understood I was seeing something I wasn't meant to, so I backed off down the road and I never told him. I wrote it in the log. R cried into the horse's neck today. Don't know why, didn't ask. I should have asked. That's the thing about a life. It's mostly the questions you were too proud or too shy to ask, stacking up behind you like unopened mail. Now the flood. Rafe got the rope on the heifer, God knows how, and I dallied it around the truck bumper on the high ground and eased her out inch by inch while the water fought me for her. She came up onto the bank hacking and heaving and alive, and Rafe came up after her on his hands and knees, soaked through, blue at the lips, and he lay there in the mud a second catching his breath. Then he said the strangest thing. He said, "That's 40. I thought he was delirious. I said, 40 what? And he looked at me, water running out of his hair and something closed in his face like a door, and he said, "Nothing. Cold's got me talking." He got up and checked the heifer's legs, and that was the end of it. But I heard him, "That's 40, like he was keeping count of something, like the heifer was the 40th entry in a ledger I couldn't see. I would understand later. Everything about that night I would understand later, which is the cruelty of understanding. It always arrives after you needed it. The valley loved Rafe and never quite trusted him, which is a thing a small place can hold in both hands at once. They loved him because of what he did. When the Peterson boy broke his leg at branding and the family couldn't cover the doctor, the bill got paid quiet, no name attached. The clinic just said it's handled. When Delphine's property tax came due the year the cattle prices cratered, somebody paid it. When the schoolhouse needed a new furnace, an envelope of cash showed up on the principal's desk with a note that said only for the kids, no fuss. Everybody had a theory. Some said it was the church. Some said it was a rich relative of the Hayes family back east. Nobody said Rafe, because Rafe drove a truck that started on the third prayer and came up $1.10 short on oats. But I kept the log, and in the log the pattern was there if you laid the pages side by side. Every gift came in a week when Rafe had been to town, to the little branch bank on Main, where he'd go in with an empty saddlebag and come out with it flat and folded shut, and never buy a thing. I told myself I was imagining it, a man that poor. It didn't fit. The mind protects itself from the truth by calling it impossible. There was one more thing I logged and didn't understand. Twice a year, in spring and fall, a car came up the valley road that didn't belong, sleek, black, city clean, the kind of car that doesn't know what to do with a pothole. It went to Delphine's, stayed under an hour and left. And after each visit Rafe would be off for a day or two. Not physically. He'd be right there fixing something, feeding something. But off, like a radio between stations, a man half here and half somewhere I couldn't follow. I asked Delphine about the car once. She got that pinched, protective look old women get, and she said, "That's Rafe's business. And it'll stay Rafe's business." And she wouldn't say more. But her eyes had gone wet, and she looked toward the barn where the horse was, and I filed that away too, a puzzle piece with no picture to fit it into. The winter Copper got sick was the winter it all came apart. He went down in January. in the cold snap that killed old Tom Alderney's whole flock and cracked the water lines under half the county. I came by Delphine's to help dig out and found Rafe in the barn on his knees in the straw, and the big horse was down flat on his side, sides heaving, and there was that smell, the sweet sour wrong smell that a horse gets when the gut's twisted, when it's colic, when it's bad. Rafe looked up at me, and I have never, before or since, seen a grown man look like that. Not at a funeral, not anywhere. It was the face of somebody watching the last light go out of a house they used to live in. "Vet's snowed in past the ridge," he said. His voice was steady, but it cost him everything to keep it there. "Roads won't clear till Thursday. He can't wait till Thursday." "We'll walk him," I said, "because that's what you do with colic. You walk them, you keep the gut moving. Come on, up, big man, up." We got Copper up. It took both of us and all we had, and the horse trusted Rafe enough to try, which was its own kind of heartbreak. We walked him in circles in the frozen yard, round and round under a sky so cold the stars looked chipped, and Rafe talked to him the whole time. Low, constant. A river of words I only caught pieces of. And the pieces didn't make sense. He said, "You remember the paddock at the big house. You remember, green all year round, they piped the water special," he said. "He never once was gentle with me, but he was gentle with you, and I hated him for it, and then he was gone, and you were all I had left of him, and I hated that worse." He said, "Don't you leave too. Everybody leaves. Don't you be like everybody. The big house, he piped the water special, everybody leaves." I walked on the horse's other side, and I held my tongue, and something enormous started to turn over in my mind. Slow, like a boulder that's been settled so long you forgot it could move. Copper made it through the night. Barely. Around 4 in the morning the horse passed what he needed to pass, blessed and awful, right there in the snow, and his sides eased and his eye cleared, and Rafe sat down in a snowbank and laughed this cracked, exhausted, weeping laugh, and I sat down next to him because my legs were done. We were quiet a while, the kind of quiet that comes after fear lets go. Then Rafe said, without me asking, in a voice sanded flat by the long night, "His name isn't Copper." I waited. "His name is on paper somewhere," Rafe said. "Registered name long as your arm. He's got a bloodline you could trace back 100 years. My father paid more for the horse that sired him than most men in this valley will earn in their lives." He wiped his face with the back of his glove. "I renamed him Copper because I wanted him to be an ordinary horse. I wanted us both to be ordinary. It doesn't take, though. You can't unbreed a thing. It's in him whether I call him a fancy name or a plain one. He is what he is." I said, careful as walking on ice, "And what are you, Rafe?" He looked at me a long moment. The sky was starting to gray at the edge, that first bruise of dawn, and I thought he was going to tell me. I could feel it right there, the whole story crouched behind his teeth. Then old Delphine's porch light came on, and the door opened, and she called out, was the horse all right? And the moment closed like water over a stone. "He's all right," Rafe called back, and to me quiet, "We're both all right." He never finished the sentence, but he'd already told me more than he knew, and more than I could hold, and I went home as the sun came up, and I opened the logbook, and I sat there with the pen in my hand for an hour and didn't write a word. Because some things you don't want to make real by writing them down. Here's what I'd worked out. By then, in the part of my mind I wasn't letting myself look at directly. The gifts around the valley, the empty saddlebag full and folded shut, the black car twice a year, the horse bred like royalty. His daddy taught him money. The big house, water piped special. That's 40. Rafe Colton was not a poor man. Rafe Colton was a rich man pretending, so hard and so long that the pretending had worn grooves in him, and I could not for the life of me understand why. Why would a man with money to pipe water to a paddock come up $1.10 short on oats on purpose? Why would he pay another man's doctor bill in secret and let his own boots go through at the sole? I didn't understand it, not yet. Because I still thought the story was about money. It was never about money. The money was just the thing his father used to hurt him with, and Rafe had spent 11 years in a valley at the edge of nowhere trying to prove, to a dead man, to himself, to a horse, that he could be worth something without it, that he could give and give and give and never once buy the thing he actually wanted, which was to be a man his father had loved for free. But I'm getting ahead again, because the truth didn't come out through me, careful old fool that I am, sitting on my guesses. It came out through Copper, in front of the whole valley, on a day that was supposed to be a celebration. And it broke Rafe Colton wide open in a way that no flood and no colic and no dead father ever had. By straight talk, I came in well under the 5,200 target on this part. Rather than pad it with filler, against our standing no padding rule, I'd rather build part 1 out properly to full length with the additional beats it needs, more of the valley, the Peterson and schoolhouse gifts shown in scene, a fuller flashback to the father's ranch. Want me to A. expand part 1 to the full ~5, 200 first, then do part 2, or B. push straight into part 2 now and circle back to expand part 1 after? Tell me and I'll run it. Part 2 orchestrated narrative continuation with distinctive voice and bittersweet resolution, orchestrated narrative continuation with distinctive voice and bittersweet resolution. Part 2. The spring sale came the first Saturday in April, the way it always did, and the whole valley emptied out onto Delphine Hayes's 40 acres because Delphine was selling off her herd. She decided to. 81 years old, and her hands had finally quit on her, and she stood on her own porch that morning in her good dress and told the crowd, in a voice that only shook a little, that it was time to let the young ones carry it. She thanked everybody for 40 years of being neighbors. She thanked Rafe last and longest, and when she said his name her voice broke clean in half, and she had to stop and press her knuckles to her mouth, and Rafe went up onto the porch and stood beside her with his hand on the small of her back until she could go on. I logged all of that later, but I'm telling you now because you have to understand the shape of the day. It was a happy day. That's what makes what happened next the thing it was. Nobody came for a funeral. Everybody came for a fresh start. The auctioneer was a fat, kind man named Buell who'd been calling sales in that valley since before I could grow a beard, and he ran the cattle through quick and clean. Good prices. Delphine's stock was fat and sound, Rafe's 11 years showing in every glossy hide, and the money that changed hands that morning would keep her comfortable in the town home her niece had found her, and everybody knew it, and it made the whole thing feel less like an ending and more like a debt being paid to a good woman by the world for once. And then Buell got to the horse. I don't know whose idea it was to sell Copper. I found out later it was Delphine's, that the horse was legally hers, had been all along, because Rafe had signed him over years back for reasons I'll get to, and she'd meant it as a kindness. She'd meant to sell the horse to Rafe himself for $1, right there in front of everyone, a public gift, a thank you he couldn't refuse or pay back or give away to somebody needier. She'd cooked it up with Buell as a surprise. She didn't know what she was doing. How could she? Nobody knew. Buell had Rafe lead Copper up onto the little rise by the barn where the light was good, and the crowd made that soft sound a crowd makes when a fine animal walks by, because even after a hard winter and his shaggy coat and his age, Copper walked up that rise like he owned the ground and was letting the rest of us borrow it. Head high, neck arched, that bred-in-the-marrow carriage that I'd noticed the first week and never had words for. And a man in the crowd, a buyer, come up from the city for the cattle, in clean boots that had never seen a stirrup. That man went very still, and then he pushed forward to the front. And he stared at the horse the way you stare at a face you know from somewhere and can't place. Buell, the man said. Buell, hold on, what's this horse's name? Buell squinted at his card. Says here Copper, grade gelding, no papers listed, aged, sound, sells as. No, the man said. No, that's not turn him so I can see his offside. Rafe had gone white. I was close enough to see it. White as the snow we'd walked the horse through in January. He didn't turn copper. He just stood there holding the lead, and his knuckles on that lead rope were bone. The city man didn't wait. He walked right up too close, the way a man does when he stopped thinking about the animal as an animal, and he lifted the shaggy mane off Copper's neck. And there, tattooed inside the lip and freeze-branded on the neck under 11 years of winter coat, was a set of numbers. The man read them out loud, and then he said a name. A registered name, long as your arm, just like Rafe had told me in the snow. I won't write the whole of it, but the last word of it, the barn name, the name that horse had been called for the first 8 years of his life before a broke young man renamed him Copper to make them both ordinary. "That's Sovereign," the city man said, and his voice cracked with something between disbelief and hunger. "That's Ellison Colton's Sovereign. Do you people know what this horse is? This horse was the last foal out of the Colton breeding program before the old man died and the whole estate went too." He stopped, because he'd finally looked at the man holding the lead rope, and I watched it happen on his face, the arithmetic, the terrible click of it, the horse called Sovereign, the Colton estate, and the lean, weathered ranch hand in the patched coat whose name everybody here knew was Colton. "You're Rafe," the city man breathed. "You're Raphael Colton, my God. Everybody thinks there's 100, and do you not, son? Do you have any idea?" "Don't," Rafe said. Just that, one word low, and it landed in the crowd like a dropped plate. "Don't." But the city man was past stopping, lit up with the awful excitement of a person watching a secret detonate. "The estate's been in probate for 11 years because they couldn't find you. $200 million sitting in trust because the heir walked off and the lawyers had you declared missing. You're a ghost. You're the most famous missing man in 3 states, and you're standing here selling cattle." And the whole valley turned and looked at Rafe Colton, the man who came up $1.10 short on oats, the man who paid the Peterson boys' doctor and the schoolhouse furnace and Delphine's back taxes out of an empty-looking saddlebag, the man who'd waded into a flood after a heifer that wasn't his and let his own hat go, and understood all at once, in one collective indrawn breath, that they had never known him at all. I need to tell you what the money was. I got most of it later, some from Rafe and some from Delphine, and some from the lawyers who descended on the valley like weather in the weeks after. But I can give it to you plain here, the way I finally understood it. Ellison Colton was one of the richest men in the Mountain West. Cattle, then oil under the cattle, then banks that held the oil money, then money that made money the way money does once it gets big enough that work becomes optional. And he was, by every account I ever heard including his own sons, a hard and joyless man who measured love in ledgers and found everyone short. He had one child, Raphael, and he raised that boy the way you'd raise a racehorse, for performance, for the family name, for the return on investment, and he never once in 26 years told the boy he loved him or was proud of him or was glad he'd been born. What he gave instead was things. A truck at 16. A horse, Sovereign, the finest foal of the finest line the Colton program ever produced, for his 18th birthday, handed over with a handshake and a lecture about what the bloodline was worth. "He gave me the best horse in the world," Rafe told me, months after the sale on a night I'll get to. "And he'd never once thrown a ball with me. And I stood there holding this fortune on 4 legs, and I understood that this was the only language he had. He couldn't say 'I love you.' He could only say 'here is something expensive.' And I was supposed to be grateful, and I was, and I hated myself for being grateful, and I hated him for making gratitude the only shape love came in." The old man died when Rafe was 26. Hart in his office, alone, working. And the will left everything, all of it, the 200 million and the banks and the oil and the ranch with the paddock where the water was piped special, to Raphael, his only child, with no conditions except the estate's own crushing size. And Rafe, 26 and gutted and free for the first time in his life, looked at all of it and understood something that I think is the truest thing I've ever heard a man say about himself. I understood that if I took it, he said, I'd become him. That's how it works. The money's not a thing you own, it's a thing that owns you back. It makes you measure people. It makes you the man other people perform for. Everybody who came near me after he died, I could see them doing the arithmetic behind their eyes. What's he worth? What can I get? Same arithmetic he did to everybody his whole life. Same arithmetic I could feel starting up in me. And I thought I could spend the rest of my life being the richest, loneliest man in the West, measuring everybody who ever loved me and finding them short, just like him. Or I said, or I could leave, Rafe said, and find out if I was worth anything at all with the money switched off. So he did. He signed papers that put the whole estate into a trust he could draw from but wouldn't touch. A trust managed by the family lawyers who sent the black car up the valley road twice a year to make him sign what had to be signed and to beg him, every single time, to come home and claim what was his. He took one horse. He drove north until the roads got bad and the names got small, and he stopped in a valley called Sweetwater because an old woman needed her fences fixed, and he became, on purpose, with his whole stubborn heart, a poor man. That's 40. I asked him about that too, eventually. What he'd been counting in the flood the night I first heard it. Lives, he said and looked away. Things I saved that were worth saving, I kept count. It was the only ledger I let myself keep. My father counted dollars his whole life and died with a number so big it stopped meaning anything. I decided I'd count something else. The heifer in the flood was 40. Delphine's whole herd over the years, that's most of it. A couple kids, a dog once. Copper the night of the colic, that was, I don't know what number that was. I lost count that night. First time I ever lost count. He almost smiled. Figured that meant it didn't need counting. The gifts around the valley, the doctor bills, the furnace, the taxes, those were the trust money. The one place he let himself spend it. He'd go to the little bank on Main, wire instructions to the lawyers, and the money would come back as cash in a plain envelope that he'd leave where it was needed with no name on it. He could give the fortune away by the handful quietly to people who'd never know it came from the richest man in 3 states. What he could not do, what would have killed the whole point of the thing, was spend $1 of it on himself. Because the second he bought himself a truck that started on the first try, he'd have started measuring. He'd have started becoming his father again. So he came up $1.10 short on oats, on purpose, as a discipline, as a prayer, as the daily small crucifixion of a man trying to stay a person. And I paid his $1.10 that first day at the feed store, and he paid me back Thursday with 1/4 of interest. Because a debt that doesn't cost you anything is a favor pretending, and Rafe Colton could not afford, in the deepest part of himself, to let anything be free. His father had made free into a lie. Rafe was going to earn every single thing down to the $1.10 for the rest of his life, or die trying. I had it so backward, all 11 years. I thought I was watching a poor man worship money. I was watching a rich man do penance with it. But the horse, it always comes back to the horse. Here's the reversal, and it's the part that still catches in my throat. Copper, sovereign, was the one thing Rafe could not give away and could not use and could not stop loving. The horse was the last thing his father ever handed him. The only warm memory in a cold inheritance, and even that memory was crooked. Because his father had been gentle with the horse in a way he'd never been gentle with the son. He never once was gentle with me, but he was gentle with you, and I hated him for it. Rafe carried that horse north because he couldn't leave it and couldn't look at it, both at once, forever. And on the day of the sale, Delphine's sweet, dying, well-meaning Delphine tried to give the horse back to him. As a gift, in public. The one transaction Rafe Colton could never survive. Something precious, handed over for $1 in front of everyone with love that he could not refuse and could not repay. She was trying to do for Rafe exactly what his father had done, and she had no idea, and it exposed him to the whole valley in the process, because a horse like that can't hide in a shaggy coat forever. The bloodline was in him whether you called him a fancy name or a plain one. You can't unbreed a thing. He is what he is. That was the irony that broke Rafe open where nothing else had. He spent 11 years proving he could be worth something without the money. And it was love that undid him, the plain, clumsy, generous love of an old woman, because love, it turns out, was the one thing his father's fortune had poisoned so deep that Rafe couldn't take it in any form without flinching. He could give it. He'd given it to the whole valley for 11 years. He just couldn't receive it. That was the wound, not the money. The money was only ever the scar tissue over the wound. I want to tell you he took the 200 million and did something grand with it. That's how these stories are supposed to go. He didn't, not the way you'd think. He stayed. That's the first thing. When the lawyers and the reporters and the long-lost cousins came up the valley road that spring, and they came, God, they came in their clean cars looking at our potholes like an insult. Rafe stood on Delphine's porch where she'd stood, and he told them he wasn't coming back to the big house ever and that they could stop asking. He was Rafe Colton of Sweetwater. He fixed fences. That was the whole of it. But he did one thing with the money, finally, out loud, with his name on it. He took the trust, all of it, the whole crushing fortune his father had used as a weapon his entire life, and he turned it into something that pays doctor bills and furnaces and back taxes for small valleys like ours all over the Mountain West. No fuss, the paperwork says, for the people who stay. He runs it out of Delphine's old kitchen with a laptop and a bad internet connection, and the same plain envelopes, except now his name's on the letterhead, because he finally decided that hiding the giving was just his father's shame wearing his own face, and he was done with it. He kept the horse. Of course he kept the horse. He bought Sovereign back from Delphine at the sale for the dollar she'd wanted. Let her have that. Let her gift him the one thing after all, and I watched him do it. Watched him take the gift with his hands shaking. Watched him learn in front of all of us how to let one single thing be free. It was the hardest thing I ever saw a man do. Harder than the flood. Harder than the colic. He shook like a leaf, and he took the dollar transaction and he pressed his forehead to that horse's neck right there in front of the whole valley, the way I'd seen him do in secret 11 years before, except this time he didn't hide it. And the crowd didn't make a sound. And old Delphine cried, and I cried, and I am not ashamed to write it in the log. Delphine passed that autumn easy in her sleep, in the town home with her niece nearby. Rafe was with her the day before. He told me she took his hand and told him she'd always known he was somebody, not rich. She didn't mean rich. She never cared a fig for that. She meant she'd always known he was somebody, from the first day he fixed her fences better than they needed fixing. And Rafe told her she was the only person in his whole life who'd known it for free. He buried her himself. Him and the horse and me and half the valley, on the rise by the barn where Copper had walked up into the light on the day everything came apart. I still keep the log, force of habit and old man's paper conscience. I read the early pages sometimes and I want to reach back through 11 years and shake myself. Ask him, I want to say, ask him about the horse, ask him about the car, ask him what 40 means. All those unopened letters stacked up behind me. All those questions I was too proud or too shy to ask. But here's the thing I've come around to. Sitting out here in the evenings watching Rafe work that old horse in the last good light, the two of them turning on a thought the way they always did. Maybe I wasn't supposed to ask. Maybe the whole gift of it, the thing Rafe gave this valley without any of us knowing, was 11 years of being allowed to love a man for exactly who he seemed to be. No arithmetic. No what's he worth behind the eyes. Just a poor, proud, stubborn, generous neighbor who came up short on oats and paid you back Thursday with interest. We got to give him the one thing his fortune had made impossible. We got to know him for free. The city man was right about one number and wrong about everything that mattered. $200 million. That's what the papers said Rafe Colton was worth. I've got 11 years of a different ledger. I've got a heifer in a flood, and a furnace for the schoolhouse, and an old woman's back taxes, and a horse walked in circles under chipped stars until the sun came up. I've got that's 40, and I've got a man learning to take a dollar's worth of love with his hands shaking. That's what he was worth. The other number was just the thing his father left him. This one he made himself. I don't write much in the log anymore. Some evenings I just sit with it open and the pen down and I watch them work, the man and the horse, and I don't feel any need to put it into words. Some things you don't want to make real by writing them down. Some things are already